Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are around the world, around the city, around the state, around the country. Welcome to another episode of the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. I'm the host, Dr. Teresa J. Canada, and we have talked about several issues since I've started the podcast sometime last year. And I just felt that I wanted to take some time to just go over why the podcast and why me. So, why the podcast? I felt that I wanted to share, educate, and expose people to the history of what took place in the North and Midwest as it relates to education from a desegregation efforts in the 1960s to the current time. And I want to talk about topics that relate then and now in the podcast. And one of the reasons I want to do this because I felt it was timely, because some people just don't know the history, and knowledge is power. So, I want people to be more powerful. And so therefore, I want to be able to share knowledge with people. Now, there's an intersection of various issues and topics in education that crosses into sports, entertainment, law, medicine, psychology, finance, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that one of the things I want to do with the podcast is to bring other voices in who are from those different fields who can talk about these issues from their personal and professional perspective. Of course, I can talk about a lot of topics, but you don't hear from me all the time. So I try to make sure at least I have at least maybe several experts who come in and talk about the different topics that may help us move forward in this country. So now previous episodes and future episodes will continue to provide such information to the audience who's listening. We need you to know. I need you to know, and we need you to know, because knowledge is key. Knowledge is power to one's success in any field. And I believe, sharing knowledge helps other people. You can take what you want from this podcast or you can leave it alone. But I'm trying to open up the venue so people can get a perspective, because basically that's what the podcast focus is sharing information and educating and exposing people to some of the history that they weren't aware of, or if they did know about it, some in-depth issues. And that's why I've also asked several people to talk about their specific situation. And ironically enough, I know many of the people who've been on the podcast, either personally, professionally, or through a person or professional situation. So I think that is key. That also speaks volumes about my ability to connect with people over my lifetime and my own personal experience growing up in New York City and in Harlem in particular. Because people think, well, at least they used to think about Harlem as being a quote unquote bad place to live. But when I grew up in Harlem, it was one of the best places to live in life for me. I mean, because of the cultural perspectives and the sense of community that is sometimes so lacking in many places, that was vibrant for me, between the neighbors. I talked about in a previous podcast episode, I believe, talking about how, people who live in a community, were supportive of each other in different ways, for especially of us students, we were going to school, we were, they were saying support, keep it going, stay positive, and just encouraged you. They may not have known what you were going to do, but they were encouraging you to move forward in your life and just try to get the best that you can get. So, that's where I'm coming from, because I felt that people need to know that people like me exist. And many people don't know that. Like I said before, my experience is, I talk about in my book, Desegregation of New York City Schools, the story of the Silk Stocking Sisters. And I'm one of the Silk Stocking Sisters. And we all talk about our experiences coming from looking at our families, looking at communities, looking at friends, and the experiences that we've gone through. And some of us are still going through that. So the question is, that was why the podcast. And let me just mention briefly about why me. I say why me, as I mentioned, because I participated in a so-called desegregation effort in the New York City public schools. And when I hear current undergraduate students say, and this is current undergraduate students now, I'm laughing, it's not funny. It says, oh, when I hear them say that they didn't know, they were unaware that public schools were segregated in the North. I said, okay, that prompted me to do something. So this podcast is an extension of topics and related issues from my book and beyond. But it also is not just my voice, it's the voice of other people and some of my former classmates who experienced this. So I thought if a student in 2022, 2021, 22, 23, in 2020, anything, in 2000, even 15, 16, 17, was unaware of that schools were segregated in the North, we have a lot of education to do. And this particular student in particular said she was, trained to become a public school, elementary school teacher. Now, if this is the person who's going to become an elementary school teacher, and she's going to be certified to teach, and was unaware that the schools were segregated in the North, we've got a lot of work to do, folks. We got a lot of work to do. Come on, let's get with it. So I'm just saying, this is my piece. So this is why I feel I'm probably the best person to talk to this, because of my own personal experience. And also the fact that, I hope to, between my episodes and individual guest episodes perspective, you're going to get a variety of various kinds of issues they're going to be talking about. I hope to inform and enlighten people of this history and current issues that have led to the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. Please consider writing comments and let me know if there are other topics you're interested in, which I would like to talk about. Because one of the things I'm thinking about, when I talked about earlier about that, the intersection of the various issues and topics of education that crosses over into sports, entertainment, law, medicine, psychology, finance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to try to bring up some of that because I grew up in New York City. And when I grew up in New York City, basketball was king. I love myself some New York City basketball growing up. And, people think of you as a certain professional, but it's another experience that has grounded me because of my exposure. So if you don't get certain exposure, you're limited in terms of what you can, sometimes your viewpoints. I mentioned another episode about social context and how important that is. But part of it had to do with exposure. You have the best intentions, but if you don't ever get exposed to anything other than where you are in your situation, and that's all you're limiting yourself. And you're also limiting your interaction with other people. I mean, I have friends from all walks of life. I have friends who live in other countries. I have really good relationships. And I think for me, relationships are important. I mean, for other people, maybe not so. But I want to be able to talk about my sports interests, my basketball interests. I just love myself some basketball, of course. Like I said before, the basketball was king and queen, more so in New York City than any place in the country when I was growing up. And that's just taken from my personal opinion. And your opinion may be different, but that's my opinion. But also, the legal issues. I had, people talking in podcasts about the legal issues that have taken place and their experience, legal issues related to schools and desegregation efforts. Also, I plan to have someone talk about, from a psychological point of view, of how, in fact, Black and Brown people's psychological well-being is impacted in school settings, especially when I talked about the previous episode about the urban schools and what was happening in the 70s with the Effective Schools movement that was basically founded by Mr. Ron Edmonds, and how he said, and basically it supported that having a school that wasn't the racial issues, it was inequality, socioeconomic inequality that made the difference in the academic aspirations pretty much of students. So we'll talk about that later in terms of, because there'll be some discussions, there's been some discussions recently. Was it not better when schools were separated, when their Black schools were separated, Black students in all Black schools? That's something to talk about because, they excelled. So it wasn't, but the key was the social economic point of view. But going back to the social context piece is this. I believe you need to have exposure to different types of situations, different people, different ways of living, and how people live in different ways in different places, around the country, around the world. And it gives you a different perspective and gets you to become more aware of life in terms of how it impacts you. So I want to make sure that I share some of that on the podcast and getting feedback from people about their own experiences and how they feel about this issue. I mean, I can't wait I can sit down and talk to somebody about psychology, of course, even finance. We need to talk about the finance because it goes hand in hand. The social and economic disparities that still continue to exist, and much of that has to do with the racial situation in this country, that certain people, even to this day, are not still offered an opportunity to be able to have a well-to-do. I mean, it's a struggle still in this country today about that. Whereas one person will get hired and the other person doesn't get hired, and it sometimes goes down to what the person looks like, and that's something we should be getting beyond. But there's so many opportunities that people can have, but then once they do have the opportunities, is it going to still make a difference once they get through the colleges and so forth and so on? Because I'm going to be talking more later on about more women's issues, because I'm a pro-woman person. And like I said, I think it's especially women of color, specifically some Caribbean women and Latino women. So I think I'm going to be talking more about that and how the education system, I think in some cases, has failed us, and the perception. I mean, even recently, discussion of what's the role for some women, to do such and such and such and such. And I'm thinking, if we think about the civil rights era, in the South, and I'm not going to touch that too much, but it was the Black women who worked in the South that allowed them to maintain their household, because the Black men, if they were part of the movement, they lost their jobs. So the women ended up working in the kitchens and housekeepers and taking care of the children for quote unquote white families. They kept their jobs. They needed them to do the work. So go back and read a little bit about that history on your own, but that's very significant. Now, it was not completely different, but there was a different focus in the North in terms of that process. But if you think about the opportunities to be able to be literate, and literacy should be a key piece that we need to think about now, because there are quite a few, illiterate people and right now in this country. But if we don't focus on being able to be literate, like I said, our focus has been on who can play the best sport or something. Especially for Black people, it's either athletics, dancing, and singing. But we need some more Black doctors. Okay, we need some more Black attorneys. We need some more Black professors. We need more of everything. Okay, we need more of everything. So I'm just saying to you, I'm hoping that you will learn more from this podcast so you can have a better perspective of what people have gone through, what we went through in terms of the history, and what's currently taking place in terms of even policies that have in place that has limited people's opportunities to be able to get an education. And it goes back to even the early childhood education. One of the previous guests talked about, the basic policy that took place in the state of New Jersey, and then also in the federal government role. So I think that one of the things I want to focus, I want to kind of keep this real. I'm just this real person. I can be very professional, I want to be, but I want to be able to do this. Now, I tell students, start where you are. You don't have to have everything in place and everything together. So I'm practicing what I say needs to be done. I've started this podcast all on my own, all by myself. I'm the host, I'm the producer, I'm the somewhat editing. I do my own writing, I do my own research. I do all of that, right? And no one right now has understands how I can keep this going. It's work, but it's worth it to me. I want to be able to share this information. So at some point, maybe I'll get a sponsor, but sometimes they don't look for people like me to be sponsored. But I'm not even going to claim that, but I'm just saying to you, I'm hoping to be able to keep moving forward and sharing this information as long as I can. So I would appreciate your support. Subscribe to the channel, put a thumbs up for liking, write some comments, And let's keep this going as much as we can. So without further ado, as I said, thank you again for listening. And I appreciate all that you do to support the channel. And for those of you who have suggestions, please provide the suggestions. You know how to reach me. And you can go to my website as well, www.silkstonkingsisters.com, and they'll have information on how to reach out to me. Without going any further, I want to thank you again for supporting the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. So until the next time, see you next time, either morning, noon, or night, or wherever you are around the world. Thank you again. Have a good one. See you next time. Bye now.